Q&A session at the end. Right, it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brad Duncan. Now, we are especially privileged to have him today because it's currently 4 a.m. where he is. So I believe he's had his breakfast and he's ready to present to us about his area of expertise. So Dr. Brad Duncan is the Adjunct Senior Lecturer with the University of New England and Senior Maritime Archaeologist for the Maritime Heritage Program at Heritage New South Wales, Australia. He's widely published in the field of maritime archaeology and specialises in maritime cultural landscapes and historic maritime infrastructure studies. His book, Please God, Send Me a Wreck, Responses to Shipwrecks in a 19th Century Australian Community, examines the social impact of shipwrecks on Victorian society. I think it's an excellent title of the book as well. His current research projects include regional and cultural landscapes, research of coastal and inland waterways, deep water defence wrecks, climate change, and geomorphological research associated with maritime and riverine heritage sites. He also does Pacific wartime sites and communities, maritime culture of Norfolk Island, and the evolution of the Australian maritime shipbuilding techniques. He's quite busy. So after 25 years working in river systems, he co-founded the New South Wales Rivers Project to explore riverine heritage across the state, a project he hopes to extend nationwide. Brad is past Vice President for the Australasian Society for Historical Archaeology and a member of Engineers Australia Heritage Community. He is the current Australian representative on the International Congress of Maritime Museums Maritime Archaeology Committee. And I understand that he's hoping to bring his research over to the UK and was all set to come over, and then COVID hit. So hopefully we can see you live at some point in future, Brad. But right now, I'd like to ask you to unmute and give us your presentation, please, Brad. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks for everyone coming along, and especially thanks for having me on the seminar series. First off, I'd like to pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past and present on whose lands I am at the moment, which is the Gadigal people in New South Wales, but also for all of the Aboriginal people on whose lands this project's operated on around Australia. What I'd like to do is just give you a really quick run through of the project that we've been doing. We call it the Rivers Project, that we've been doing for the past 10 years or so in New South Wales, and I've been doing on and off around Australia before then. And I just want to give you an introduction to how the project started, what we were doing, how it generated from very humble sort of beginnings, and then give you a couple of specific examples. I can't cover everything in this because there's so many aspects of working in the rivers, but what I'd like to do is cover two industries, the sugarcane industry and the timber and wool industries down in the Murray River, and then just give you a bit of an overview of the project, and that'll take us through to the end of the presentation. I work in New South Wales. I'll pop a map up in a minute for you. They're pretty all going, where's New South Wales for anyone who doesn't live in Australia. But just to give you an idea, we currently, when this project first started, we had about 2,000 wrecks that were known along the New South Wales coastline. And the focus of the program was mainly on shipwrecks that actually occurred in the oceanic or harbour scenarios. But where this project came from, which I'll touch on in a couple of minutes, is that we began to receive a couple of oral history reports and reports of new archaeological sites that started to give us a bit of an indication that there was a really big resource of wrecks that were in the rivers, and also archaeological sites that were in the rivers that really hadn't been systematically investigated up until that time. Having said that, I have to pay homage to a few people. Sarah Kenderdine did a fairly, not comprehensive, but fairly good starting project in the Murray River in the 1990s, and she worked with the South Australian Heritage Branch and also heritage branches in New South Wales and in Victoria, documenting sites that were along the river. Now, it was a really great start to that project, and it used Krista Westerdale's emerging maritime cultural landscapes approach to actually look at potential sites that were in the rivers. And it offered a lot of potential, but it was actually never picked up. So after she'd produced the two fairly voluminous reports on it, no further work was really done in those regions, and which was a shame because the potential there is quite vast. David Nutley and Tim Smith also have done a bit of work in the rivers in New South Wales. There was a couple of historical overview studies which were undertaken as part of the Heritage Office's investigation of the Clarence River and the Richmond River. But there was only partial archaeological investigation of sites in those areas, and it was normally on an ad hoc basis as sites were declared. They've also done some work in the Mile Lakes, and they've also done some work in the Murrumbidgee rivers and the Murray and Darling. But again, it was on an ad hoc basis. And what I've started to realise as this project started to unfold is that we needed to actually start doing it a bit more systematically and looking at the range of sites that were actually occurring in individual rivers. Now, what got me really interested in this, to start off with, there was a couple of circumstances. I'll just tell you with one, where we had a guy who was up in the Kalang River, which is just a bit south of Coffs Harbour. I'll show you a map in a minute. And he rang us up and said, gee, I found this wreck. You've got to come and have a look at it. I can see it from the boat. I can't get in to dive it myself. And of course, the night before, when I was catching the plane up the next morning, it rained. And when I got up there, it was like a chocolate milkshake in the water. And after going up a couple of times to have a look at this stuff, I said to him, look, I can't keep coming up for this unless there's other things up here to have a look at. And he said, oh, no, there's no other wrecks or there's no other sites here. And I said, well, what about old wharves and things? And his exact words to me were, I think there's a bit of rusty old crap further up the river. And that rusty old crap turned into at least five previously archaeologically undocumented types of wrecks, which were droga wrecks used in the timber industry in the Kalang and Bellingen rivers, but for most of New South Wales, for the northern sections of New South Wales. So it got me thinking, well, what else is there out there? Tim and David had done a really good job on documenting wreck sites that were up and down the coast, but they had no idea these ones even existed. And I thought, well, if that's the case for a really small river like the Kalang River, what else is there that's out there that's never been investigated before? So the areas that I'll be talking about today is, I'll be talking about the Murray River through here, which is Australia's biggest river system. The Murray River itself is about 2,500 kilometres long. Is fed in by the Darling River, which is 1,400 kilometres long, and the Lachlan and the Murrumbidgee, which are about the same length. So you're talking about 6,000 kilometres worth of navigable rivers, just in those small rivers themselves. But as I'll show you in this slide, there's over 55 river systems in New South Wales. That's systems. That's not individual rivers. That's systems that actually either lead in from the coast, so the coastal rivers, or they're inland, big inland rivers in the same way that. Sorry, my cats are attacking each other. If you can hear them in the background. They're rivers that feed into the Murray-Darling inland river system. There's also 47 different bar entrances, and there's multiple navigable river systems in the ways of, you've got estuaries, you've got lakes, you've got small creeks, etc. And almost all of them, once we've started looking into it, almost all of them have some sort of navigation system that's actually being used in those regions. So as you can see here, that the potential for new types of sites, not just shipwreck sites, but all the associated infrastructure in those areas are vast. The way we first started this project off was after we became aware that, okay, well, look, there's the potential for things out there. How do we find out what's out there? So what I did was I got an intern to start working with Catherine Jenkins from UNE, the University of New England. And we used a local website that's provided by the National Library here called Trove, which is basically all the Australia's online newspapers are available through there. And we did some really simple searches, such as sink, sank, sunk, and rivers. And in the space of about 5 months that she was working on the project, she came up with 300 new wrecks and numerous other types of maritime infrastructure sites. And these were new sites. These were sites that we didn't know anything about. And so this was just like starting to, scrape the cream off the top of the cake and actually have a look at what was underneath. And it also gave us a really interesting insight into the general trends that were going on in the rivers, and the general histories of how the rivers were developing, etc. So it gave us a good start to the project and gave us an overview of what type of sites we might actually find in those regions. as I said previously, I've been working in New South Wales on this project for over 10 years. This is a project that I started not long after first coming here. In that time, we've worked in at least 30 different river systems and 11 inlets, lakes and creeks. It's been quite amazing, the scope of sites that we're finding that occur even in narrow backwaters, you know, that are only, in some cases, only 10 metres wide. We've come up with identified over 1,000 new sites archaeologically in that area, and numerous other historical sites in those areas. We've been working quite closely with University of New England, and previous to that, University of Sydney, in conjunction with Professor Martin Gibbs. And what's interesting in this is that it ties that land-sea barrier, or the water terrestrial divide that there's been a lot of talk about, that, you know, it's almost an artificial divide, that we should actually be looking at, you know, how those systems actually link in together. And this ties into the new UNESCO convention, which looks at different types of sites that you might find underwater as well too. So the project has actually been working collaboratively with other states in the country. So we've been working with South Australia, looking at all the sites that are at the bottom end of the Murray River, and also in Victoria and New South Wales. We've also been working at cross-border projects up in Queensland, and we're hoping to run future projects down at a place called Echuca, which I'll show you a bit more about in a minute. Heritage New South Wales also runs a thing called Wreckspotters. So it's a little bit of like an equivalent of AIM and NAS, but it's a state-based program where we try to train local people up who have an interest in maritime heritage to actually become our eyes and ears on the ground. But it then gives us a pool of volunteers which we can then take with us on field work who are trained, and we train them with the AIM and NAS course as a basis for that. But it also, one of the main things with this as well too, is it also engages the local community in their own riverine heritage. So what it does is it pulls people out of the network and then start to tell us about more sites they know about. They don't have to be divers to be involved, which is quite a bonus. So you can get people who are older and who haven't got a diving background to become involved. And it's increased exponentially the amount of sites that we're actually looking at in different regions. You can see this is one of the a couple of the Wreckspotters courses that we're running here. So what are we looking at? You know, when you look at rivers, I know in Australia, when you talk to people about rivers to start off with, they go, okay, well, what are we looking at? Oh, you know, it's people going down the rivers in paddle boats, and, you know, they're, you know, merrily chopping up and down the rivers, going to, you know, different picnic spots, etc. And that's, in some ways, that's true. You have recreational landscapes within the rivers, particularly in Australia. But the rivers, more likely in Australia, they're actually highways into the interior of the country. And particularly in Australia, up until the 1950s, in some areas, there were no roads, or there was no rail in some areas because of the low-lying area, or marshy or swampy, or economically it wasn't worthwhile putting railway into those areas. And so what you're looking at in the river systems is you're actually looking at massive industrial landscapes that facilitate the transport of resources up and down the river systems, and in addition to the transport of people and culture up and down the river systems as well. So you can see here that these are some of the craft. I'll talk about some of these a bit later on, but you can see it's not necessarily that pretty, beautiful landscapes that we go and look at now in the rivers and think, oh, isn't that a lovely, pristine environment? It wasn't. It was a huge industrial landscape that actually linked cities and townships, both up and down the rivers, but also up and down the coast of New South Wales and the rest of Australia and the world. So they're really important ties that led to the economic development of Australia. But they also facilitated, so if you're looking at industrial landscapes, you're not just looking at, you know, the transport of produce, you're actually looking at the different riverine communities that existed in those areas. And so you've got to service the needs of those people moving up and down the rivers. So you're also looking at, you know, not only the provision of services, you know, some rivers here still have garbage boats, which actually take the garbage away instead of the garbage trucks. There was the cream boats that used to bring the milk up and down the rivers. There was the store boats that was like the floating Coles or Sainsbury's that would go up and down the river selling produce to people. So if you're going to examine rivers, you also need to look at the communities that lived on them. And so it's another aspect of what we're looking at here. but more importantly as well too, we're not just looking at wrecks. You know, the wrecks are the sexy side of things that everyone loves to see, but you're looking at all the associated infrastructure that's there as well too. And there's the typical stuff that you'd expect, like the piers and the wharves and the jetties and the slipways. But there's also other things like, you know, the small boat houses where people would go recreationally and they'd hire a boat out on a Sunday afternoon when they're having picnics. There was the processing of wool and wool scouring facilities. There was the dry docks that you can actually see down here. There was even things in Australia where there was big flying boat bases on the rivers and lakes, and some of them miles inland as a security precaution to get away from possible Japanese bombing. And other things such as navigational markers that you would normally expect along the coast. You're getting the same things that are occurring in the river systems, and also other things which I imagine you may also have in, excuse me, England, such as tidal mills. So as the tide came in, it would actually turn the mill wheel one way, and then when the tide went out, it would turn it again. And so the potential for the types of sites you're looking at here is absolutely vast. And I can't cover everything in this talk, so I'll start to get onto a bit more focused stuff in a few minutes. One of the other things that we're also interested in with this is that Australia was colonised by people with a far longer time depth in this nation than we were. Aboriginal people have been here at least 55,000 years. So I can't cover the whole 55,000 years, obviously, of their occupation here. But what I'm interested in is how did Aboriginal people and their culture change, and how did they adapt to the rivers and change the way that they use the rivers over time. Now, Aboriginal people didn't necessarily, they weren't just swimming in rivers, they weren't just hunting for fish and things like that. Rivers meant things to them. There was law around creation spirits, etc. were strongly focused around the river systems. But in historical periods, Aboriginal people weren't just passive players on the rivers. In this slide that you can actually see here, this is Yarra and Jackie sculpture, which is actually at Gundagai. And these two really brave Aboriginal men in the 1850s rescued over 55 people during the Great Flood that went through Gundagai, in just basically a bark canoe that was actually launched from the side of the river at great peril to themselves. And we're also finding that Aboriginal people up and down the river systems, were pivotal in the operation of a lot of the industrial barge systems that were going on, particularly in the Murray River, but also in other riverine systems as well too. And their folklore continued. So there's a fascinating paper by Roberts that was published in IJNA in 2017 called "They Call Him Crowie." I haven't got time to go into it, but I would strongly suggest you have a look at that. So moving on to the one of the case study areas that I want to present today. The Clarence River is in what they call the Northern Rivers region in New South Wales. So Sydney's down here, Newcastle there. Most people probably wouldn't even know where New South Wales is. So, but the Northern River System is basically it's probably a couple hundred kilometres just south of the Queensland New South Wales border, which is up around here. The Clarence River System, we had maybe I think it was about 20 or 30 wrecks that we knew existed in there, and about probably about 15 that we actually knew of the locations for. By the time we'd finished working in this river system, after 5 days of field work, we'd identified and documented over 100 craft during that period, and numerous maritime infrastructure sites, which was quite interesting, which gave me a strong interest in what was going on in this region. So the area that I want to concentrate on is around here, which is close to the entrance to the Clarence River in a place called Yamba. But I want to talk about Harwood Island. Now, Harwood Island was the central focus of the sugarcane industry that was actually operating up and down the coast in the Northern Rivers region since at least about the 1860s, and was predominantly working in that area from the 1870s onwards. Now, when sugarcane was actually manufactured and grown in this region, there was no road system, there was no rail system. The only way of actually getting around was actually by boat. And what you can see here is the system that they used to transport all the materials with. This is actually a train of about 7 or 8 barges. And what they would do is they would bring sugarcane from the farm to the mill. And this is what I want to talk about in this part of the presentation. Now, these operated in the area here right up until the 1970s. It was only with the introduction of rail and road networks in this region that it completely killed the riverine trade. The cane barges could transport many tons of cane down the river, and they were serviced by these tugs, which looked fairly, innocuous, and that they couldn't move much. They're only 40-foot long vessels, though. They're just over probably about 15, 12 metres long. But they used to transport trains of anything up to 20 barges at a time down the river. Now, what got us interested in this area was we were informed by a local ranger in this region that he'd found a couple of barges in one of the mangrove swamps in a place called James Creek off of the Clarence River. Upon inspection in this area, we actually found that it was 18 or 19 barges in the end, only one of which had been previously known. And there was also a paddle steamer wreck in this region that had been documented previously. So what was interesting in here was that we had a previously unknown class of vessel that had never been archaeologically investigated before. And we had at least 8 or 9 examples of this type of vessel to start off with. By the time we left, there was 19, I think, in this region. So the majority of these types of vessels were actually made of iron L bar bracket iron frames with timber planks and flat bottoms. They were 20 metres long, and there was multiple examples of them in the swamps in these areas. And there was also these things, which were quite interesting. We couldn't work out what they were. There were iron pipe, and there was an iron pipe at each end of the vessel. And at first, I thought it might have been a tie-off post or something similar. So what we started to do was go through and document the different types of construction methods, and we could actually look at how these vessels were built, but you could also see where the vessels had been repaired, etc. And so, which made for a very interesting study. Some of the vessels, because it was, someone christened this Shrek archaeology, because in some places we're up to our knees in mud, basically going through the swamp trying to document these sites. And in some cases, the vessel was only evident by where it had killed the mangrove, it stopped the mangrove from actually growing any further. So we had ghost images coming through these vessels through the mud and the swamp. Now, as I mentioned, there was actually, in the end, there was actually 18 or 19. This is a current image, unfortunately, in the swamp. And it was quite interesting that the location of these vessels was quite a strong interest to a geomorphologist afterwards. Professor Martin Toms, who's also working on this project with us, which I'll talk about later on. Now, that was one graveyard in the area. Now, we also came across another graveyard quite by accident, in that someone had told us about this particular vessel that you can see in the left-hand picture, bottom right-hand corner. There was an iron barge in that area that someone had told us about, they'd seen in a paddling magazine. And when we zoomed in on Google Earth to try and find it, we actually saw these things along the sides of the coast, and we were going, oh my God, I think, what is that? Is that a wreck? When we got there was actually 43 wrecks in this region. And it turned out it was an area that, when the end of the barge era of transportation for the sugarcane industry had occurred, they ended up dumping 43 barges along the ends of this island. And most of them were in various states of repair or disrepair. But what was interesting about this whole area was that we had 6 different types of barge construction techniques and multiple examples of each, which showed the development of the sugarcane barge ship construction techniques from the beginning of the industry to the end, which is fairly unique well, absolutely unique in my experience in New South Wales. No one had ever seen a graveyard to this extent. And so we had, we had timber vessels with iron frames, as you can see here. Some of them, they had a very big beamy, like a a beamy hull on them, which would, when we first saw them, resembled almost Viking longships in a way, with a very prominent bow and stem and stern posts. We had this as well too, which I hadn't seen before we started doing work in the Murray River, which is a iron topsides, and I'll talk about this when I get to the Murray River section. But again, the innocuous posts. So what are these posts? What are they doing here? Because we also had night heads on these things. There was also, so as time went on, these barges developed, and so they became, they started to, instead of being built in timber, they started to build them in iron. And here's the one surviving example that's left of an iron barge, which is at Ferry Park in Maclean on the Clarence River. You can see big beamy vessels, very robust, very sound, can take huge loads, and these are the towing posts that you can see that we used to tie the vessels together and tow them down the rivers. And later on in their development, they actually did away with the classic design, and they decided they would go with basically a harbour barge, construction barge, and it was made of steel pontoon barge, and we've got examples of those up and down the rivers as well too. But so what we're looking at here is 6 different generations of cane barges. So now we've got the ability to actually compare not only the development of the sugarcane barges and how they were built, but how they were repaired, what construction techniques they were using, how they maintained them, etc., which is sort of absolutely unique in this area. We also, once we started looking, there was not 2 graveyards. There was actually 6 in the area, and those are the ones that we came across. And every day that we're in the area, people were saying, "Oh, I think there's a couple of barges a bit further up there," and we go up, and there'd be even more of them. And in the end, the initial excitement we were having about finding barges, oh God, another bloody barge again. But by the end of this, we'd actually documented over 100 different vessels that were existing, and the majority of them were sugarcane barges. So what does that tell you about an area? It shows the importance of the industry that was here. You can also see here that where the different paddocks and layouts on Harwood Island itself is completely concentrated around the growing and the harvesting of sugarcane in the area. So it's completely transformed the landscape from what you can see on the left-hand side here, which was basically rugged bushland and swampland at one stage, to a completely anthropomorphized, sorry, it's too early in the morning, I haven't had a coffee, completely man-made and altered landscape. So the other types of things that I've been looking at in this area is that, okay, well, you know, sugarcane production isn't just about, you know, cutting it down and throwing it onto boats. How do they do it? So what's the material culture that you're actually looking at? And I'm looking at the development of how people harvested the cane. So initially it was harvested by gangs of men. Gangs would be anything up to 15 guys. There would be people allocated, 2 or 3 guys would actually be given the task to actually carry the sugar cane down to the barge and load it onto the barge. It was actually picked up in bigger lots using this thing on the bottom right-hand corner here called a shin stick, innocuous piece of wood. If you found it in the field, you wouldn't know what it was. And over time, as different technological developments came into this area, such as even basic things like, you know, being able to get a horse and cart in there, it did away with men having to carry the stuff down to the foreshore, to suddenly they could be allocated to loading it onto the boat. And so the imposition of small things like carts and then tractors and then tramways dramatically changed the industry as they went over time, and led to not only economic changes in the way that people could operate, but it also led to changes in the structure of how people operated in teams within these areas as well. One of the interesting things that we started to find here, which we'd driven past lots of times and never realised what they were these things. And so these are derrick cranes. And what was interesting in the Clarence River was that often a derrick crane would be put on the side of the river. There was no jetty or pier or any other structure or wharf or anything that was there to facilitate loading. What they would do was they would actually swing the arm of the crane around, pick up a load of sugar, dump it onto the barge, and then that was a continuous process. And then the next barge would be moved along. And at the beginning of each day, sugarcane barges would be brought up from the mill, and left for the farmers to fill up, and as they had enough, the tugboat would come back again. And we documented probably about 40 or 50 of these, which had never been known of before. Some of them in the middle of swamps, some of them still sitting on the sides of the banks. And each one of those indicated a nodal point in the farmers' landscapes where there was a confluence of where the land met the sea, basically, or met the river. And so they're a very important parts of the landscape, and working out where the concentration of activities were, particularly with the rivers. As part of the river transport system, you can't have boats without facilities to look after them. So there was lots of, in some areas, mooring piles that were located, as you can see in the bottom area here. This is a thing called the stringer, where the boats were actually tied up for mooring piles along the sides of the refinery until such time they could be unloaded, or when they were empty and they were ready to go out to the farms. But you're also looking at other things such as the cranes. You're looking at the slipways and the boat building and facilities that are associated with them, of which there are a lot along the river. The refinery itself had its own boat building and maintenance facilities. And also, we were looking at the different types of boats that occurred, which I'll touch on in a minute. But one of the things that I just wanted to mention, which actually really surprised us, was the size of the pardon me, the size of the channels that were being used. So wherever there was a small creek, it was being used to facilitate transport within the area, and it changed the way we were looking at the way that people used the river systems, and that you were finding archaeological signatures and use of very small transport systems going into very small creeks and tributaries off the rivers itself. In fact, they were probably used more than the main river because sometimes the vessels would sink. Which gets onto this. So there was different types of ancillary vessels that also supported the sugarcane industry. So occasionally, when they would be towing the sugarcane barges down the river, they would be struck by a big blow as you've got a long fetch down the river. And so some of the barges would be caught side onto the wind as they were going around a river bend, and sometimes they would tip over. And so rather than abandon the barge, these poor guys would get the job of having to try and raise it. And so they would put these two barges, one on either end, and they were called salvage barges. They were converted sugarcane barges that had a winch on one end, which would lead over a fair lead, and both of these were attached, one to either end of the vessel, and then it would be slowly winched up, and the weight of the vessel would stop the weight of the salvage vessel would stop it actually turning over. And while the vessel was coming up, these poor guys had to get into the water up to their waist and throw the sugarcane onto a barge that was close to it. One of the other things that was interesting that we came across was this thing, which was a pump barge. And we got back to the posts that we were talking about earlier on, and I couldn't figure out what they were. The way that farmers would they would throw all their sugarcane onto these barges, but of course they had no idea of how much had gone on. So if you've got produce coming to market, you've got to have a way of weighing it. So what would happen at the beginning of the season was each barge that was used, each sugarcane barge, would actually be completely emptied, and they would get a 44-gallon drum full of water, and they would put it in, and the posts that I was talking about that were in the bow and the stern were actually a post that went right through the middle of the vessel and through the bottom of the vessel as well. And what it was a bit like a plimsoll line, but on the inside of the vessel. And so what they would do is they would put a 44-gallon drum in. They would then drop a stick with a little float on the end of it down there, and they would take a measurement up. And that would give you an idea of what 1 tonne of produce would be in depth for the vessel. And so they would keep doing that until they got to, so they had a chart which indicated how much at different tonnages that the vessel would be sitting in the water in the bow and the stern. And so this vessel here, the pump barge would come along. Before they actually took the measurements, the pump barge would come in. There was a dedicated hatch at the front of the vessel, so you could just see in this area here, and that would pump all the water out. They'd take the measurement, and they could work out what the exact measurement and weight of the produce was that was being brought to market. Quite ingenious. I've never seen this done anywhere else. So if anyone knows about that anywhere else, I'd certainly be interested. but we're also looking at the sugarcane industrial landscapes themselves. So this is the Harwood mill. This is back in about the 1930s, I think. This shot was actually taken. You can see here what's called the stringer, and so what would happen was the barge captains would actually bring the barges alongside. They would come in through here. The vessel would be unloaded with a grab claw. It would go into the mill itself, and a crusher powered by two horizontal trunk engines, steam engines, which are still operating, and it would crush up the mill, and then it would be processed from there. Now, I can't go into this in much more detail than this in this lecture, unfortunately, but it's quite an interesting and still dynamic and still operating landscape that goes back at least 100 years. So for research opportunities that we're looking at in this area, obviously, we're looking at the evolution of barges in this region. We're actually trying to get a field school run in this area, because most of these sites can be accessed without even getting wet, or more than your feet wet anyway. We've looked at the different types of infrastructure that's being used in these regions, such as the cranes, the mill, the wharfs and pier, and shipbuilding facilities, etc. But one of the other interesting things that's coming out of this is that I've been talking to Ian McLeod and Vicky Richards at West Australian Maritime Museum about the possibility of using these sites as indicators of climate change by looking at the chemical deterioration of multiple examples of the same types of vessels, not only in this river, but like up and down the New South Wales coast, and looking at seeing whether you can actually make observations about whether climate change is actually affecting these sites over time, and in different river systems, and in different scenarios within those rivers. And because we've got so many different types of vessels, this is a really exciting possibility that is still in its infancy, I must admit, but it's certainly an area that we're very interested in looking more at. Now, I mentioned Martin Toms, the coastal geomorphologist who's working with UNE. He was quite interested in what was going on with the sugarcane barges here, because one of the things that we realised was that, okay, what we're looking at here isn't one dumping event, it's actually multiple. And so what we've got is there's one dumping event going on here, and you can see that it's led to the accumulation of and siltation of this area. And then you've had another dumping event here, and another one there, and another one there. And so it started us thinking about, well, what's happening with when you put wrecks into this environment, what's actually happening to it? How is it actually changing the river? The river's not only changing the wrecks, but the wreck is changing the riverine system itself. And also what we're finding, because of the graveyards themselves, some of them have deliberately been placed, like the big graveyard with 43 different sites in it, have been deliberately placed to actually as erosion control devices, but also as training walls, which actually speed the current up in channels where siltation was a problem. So there's multiple facets, as well, I suppose, what I'm trying to get across here. So I'll move on to quickly to Mildura and Echuca, which is on the Murray River. As I said, Murray River is a 2,500 kilometre long river system, which is basically the lifeblood to inland eastern Australia. The areas I'm going to talk about in Mildura, Swan Hill is here, Kundruk, and Echuca. Now, we started looking at the Murray River in 2015. I did an initial trip up there with Heritage Branch. And why we went there was the Murray River has an accumulation of different weir systems that were put in dating from about the 1890s or 1880s, sorry, I can't remember the exact date. And they were designed to provide navigable river areas along the Murray, and I think there's 20 or 30 of them along the whole system there. But what they do is that every couple of years, every 3 or 4 years, they silt up. And so what they do is they can actually take these trestles out, which form the weirs themselves, and it means that they can flush all the river silt out. Some of the sources we've been dealing with here is that we're not just looking at archaeological sites, we're actually dealing quite closely with with the local people, and they're integral parts of this project. And so some of the people you can see here, Mark Smith, who's works at the Swan Hill Pioneer Settlement, and Ruth Rendell, who works with the Historical Society, have both got quite strong knowledge of shipbuilding techniques, but also the cultural landscapes of the areas that people use in these regions, and how they use the rivers, and the knowledge of riverboat captainage and pilotage of these rivers. So at first I wasn't interested in paddle steamers, so I'm not going to talk a lot about paddle steamers here. I thought, oh yeah, paddle steamer's a paddle steamer, it's all the same. It's actually not. There's about 6 or 7 different types. But what we tried to do when we first went into this area was we were starting to look at these sites, and we weren't recognising what we were looking at. The construction techniques were so different in a lot of cases to what you're actually finding on vessels that were being piloted in the ocean, that we weren't recognising what the wrecks were, or when they were a wreck. So the other thing that I've been looking at as well is, this is just getting off an aside, is the different rudder types, and whether the types of rudders can actually, if you find the rudder archaeologically, whether you can identify the vessel from the size of the rudder, and that's looking very promising as well too. But look, what I want to, I'm not going to talk about paddle steamers, that's another talk in itself. What I want to talk about is 2 different types of vessels that were really unusual, that we're seen going up and down the rivers. Now, the first I'll talk about is this one. It's called an insider barge, and it's a very innovative name because they put stuff inside. That's why they've called it that. But as you can see from these pictures, they carried vast cargoes. Some of these vessels were up to 130 metres long. That's probably 40 something metres plus long. These vessels were anything up to 12 feet high when they were pulled out of the water. So that means you've got another 3 or 4 metres of depth here, and they would stack stuff anything up to 4 or 5 metres above the deck. So they were the workhorses, they were the trucks of the Murray River before there was ever any road networks in this region. You can see they carried quite heavy cargoes. So when we first started looking at these vessels, as I was saying before, you know, like we were like, oh, they've got bulkheads on them. Oh, that's interesting, you know, because we didn't know a lot about the riverine systems at all until we started looking into these. And this is a vessel that was actually pulled up into a gully when the river was in the flood season to get it out of the river so they could maintain it, and someone never took it out again. So this is a form of infrastructure in itself, this gully, because before there was dry docks and anything else for the river, they were making their own. So one of the things that was confusing for us as well too when we first had a look at these vessels was, okay, you've got bulkheads in here, but you've got keelsons going through the middle of them. So are they being used for watertight reasons? Are they being used to give structural strength to the vessel? So if you can see back in this slide here, you know, they've got a very open construction in the middle of it. So you've probably got a lot of hydrostatic pressure on the side of these things. So how do you stop them? The pressure not only of the water from caving them in, but also the great weights. They were carrying hundreds and hundreds of tons of produce down the rivers. So, and this one was even more perplexing. We looked at this vessel and we were shaking our heads with, well, what are these things? At first we thought they were frames, and in the end we realised there was triple frames all the way along the sides of the vessel. So what were these? And I've called them diagonal braces at first because we had no idea what they were. You know, we weren't sure what they were actually used for. And we also visited another site. Someone had said in Kundruk that there was a wreck down there, and we went down there and we only found these things. And we were looking and going, what the heck is that? Is that a wreck or isn't it a wreck? And so it started me thinking about, well, from one of the first things we need to do is actually work out what the archaeological signatures are of these things. You know, if we go to a site and we don't recognise there's a wreck there, you know, how do you start getting an inventory together and start understanding what the archaeological resource is? So it started me looking at documenting the way that these vessels were actually made. And you can see here, these were what we called skids. And so you can see there's an iron brace that would go over the top of it, and another one would actually go over the top of the gunnel. And it's exactly the same dimensions, exactly the same construction techniques here. And that iron skid would actually go under the dirt that you've got here across the middle of the vessel and up the other side. And what this was designed for was that when they were being used in the timber industry, they would be rolling logs, quite large logs, into the middle of these vessels. And they had the potential that one of those logs would actually hit the side of the planking and it would sink the vessel. So what these were basically protective mechanisms within the middle of the vessel to actually stop the vessel being holed and sunk. The other thing that we'd never seen before, which I'd be interested to see, with this construction technique is over in England as well too, is they used to have iron topsides. And so what would happen in New South Wales, particularly in the interior, was that if you had a vessel that was actually sitting, you can see the white section at the bottom of the boat in the right-hand corner here, if it was actually sitting in the water empty and the timbers at that level were wet, then they would be sprung and they wouldn't leak. But if it was timber topsides on here, as soon as you loaded it with a couple of 100 tons and it sank into the water, because it was so dry, the timbers had contracted and so they wouldn't be waterproof and the vessel would sink. So what they did in these areas was they actually constructed the topsides of the vessels out of iron. And iron not only offered a robust material for the heavy loads that we're using, but it also, what would happen is that as the iron sank into the water, it was waterproof, but it also meant that the outside of it, because it was iron, as it rusted, you'd just get a flaking section of it would come off, and you'd still have, mechanically sound section of iron underneath. And there's still a number of vessels of this size still evident up and down the Murray. And one of the archaeological signatures of this, which was quite interesting, was that when we saw this stern post on a vessel called the Alpha, which is a paddle wheel steamer in Mildura, we actually thought that this was a rudder gudgeon at first, and in fact what it is the remains of the iron topsides. The steering of these vessels was actually quite interesting in that there was no pintles. So you normally have a gudgeon on the vessel side. You would have pintles on the rudder, and the rudder would be secured by the pintle slotting into the gudgeon. Now there was no multiple pintles being used for this. There was a center gudgeon pin, which was used to hold them together. And the reason this was used was that as you were going through the river and there's lots of logs in the river, if it hit, it would de-ship the rudder. And so what they did was they would put this pin through the middle of it and bend the end of it over. Now the vessel was actually steered by chains, as you can see by the image here. And so that went through a spreader bar across the stern of the vessel, which and then went along the deck and was linked to a windlass style steering platform, which was called, obviously, it was called a steering platform itself. And that could be adjusted to move not only up and down the vessel, but it could be moved to go up and down vertically. When these vessels were being steered, they were actually they were towed behind paddle steamers or paddle boats, they call them down here. And so the steering mechanism had to be high enough up. If you were trying to steer from the back here, you wouldn't have been able to see what was going on. So the steering mechanism was actually moved on top of the cargo. And so it gave you the ability, depending on the size of the cargo and what you were traveling with, that you could actually move this around. Now there was a thing, I don't know whether this is where the original term bailout came from, but they would actually take a bail out from behind where the steering mechanism was, because these things often would get caught in river currents and be swept underneath trees on the side of the bank. And so what would happen was the guy would jump into the bailout area, and this whole mechanism would be swept off by the tree and over the side, but retained by the chains that were holding it there. And you can also see one of the methods that they were using for actually tying the bales to the vessel was they never put ropes over the top of the vessel, because if the vessel started to tip with a river current, it would just completely tip and go over. If they tied them horizontally around the middle of the vessel, then the top layer would slide off, and they could just retrieve the wool bales from the river afterwards. And then there were these vessels, and you look at these, and I've yet to find anyone who's seen anything like this anywhere in the world. It's totally, I think, an invention of the Murray River. Now, where they came from is that Murray River red gum doesn't float. It's one of the few timbers in the Australian region that, you put it in the water, it'll sink. So if you've got very big vessels, if you've got very big lengths of timber that you need, and you can't put them inside a barge, the only way to get them down there is to use this, and they're called Outrigger Log Barges. So what happens is that they basically put these logs that are permanently mounted across the middle of the deck, and then logs are brought into the side and actually pulled up and chained to the underside of the vessel. Now, you can't tow an outrigger log barge when it's full because there's too much resistance in the water. You rip the stem out of the vessel that it's being towed with. So you can see these vessels are actually being towed up to the area where the logs are being harvested out of the forests. And so what was interesting with this from a social perspective is that wherever you know where the forests are, you know that the timber from those forests that are being transported by the outrigger log barges can only go to a mill that's downstream because you can't tow them upstream because there's too much resistance. So there are other ancillary craft associated with this industry as well, which I only just found this picture of on the last lot of field work I was doing down there. This is the Barmah Forest. The Barmah Forest is one of the richest reserves of Murray River red gum in the region. It's sometimes a long way away from the river, but in the middle of winter it actually floods. And so what happens is in the middle of summer they would go into the forest. As you can see by the bottom picture here, they would actually chop the logs down, chop down as many as they could, and they would mark them with a steel pile through the middle of the log to actually indicate where the center of the log was. And then they would actually leave it with a steel pile coming out through the center, poking up, and they'll come back with this vessel in the middle of winter. They would go over the top of the barge. They had a winch over the top of the log. They had a winch coming down from the barge, which would pull the log up into the middle of the vessel, and then it would be floated out to the riverbanks where it would be loaded against the outrigger log barges. Now, these vessels, the way they would construct them was almost similar to a normal, like a 12 or a 13-foot long boat. And if you could think of that boat being sawn down through the middle, and then they would put planks to connect, like to flatten off both sides, and then they just put a platform between the middle of them. Now they're called pontoons, and apparently these were quite common in the different forests up and down the state. So when these vessels were being loaded, they would bring them into the shore. These poor guys would actually have to float the logs or like roll the logs out in the water, which were attached by chains to these things, which were very, very coarsely constructed windlasses, which would then pull the logs in and up to the side of the boat where they were secured with chains. There was very different construction techniques on these things as well because of the heavy loads they were actually taking, and also because the areas where they were working in, they had things called stem irons on the front, which is a bit like a cutwater that you would find in an ocean-going vessel, but also these collision straps at the front, and they were used because there was lots of logs in the water and they were often hitting things. But the interesting things that were in these were what remains of the windlasses. Fairly innocuous, really rudimentary sort of construction to them, and had never been documented before either. Now you might say, okay, well, so what? You know, like, what does that mean? Well, if you don't understand what one of these barges looks like, how do you recognise them in the river itself? Now, we've walked past these types of things a few times, going down and looking for the sites. What you're looking at here, this is the top end of a windlass. This is at a place called conduit, and these are what's remains of the outrigger log barges. So what we've been trying to do as part of this project, and I've not even shown you the beginnings of the characterizations here, is that we're trying to characterize the types of archaeological signatures that you're looking at, so you can identify what these sites are, both where you can see them, but also where you can't. And so this here, I'll just give you a quick example. This is the Murray River Sawmills log barge that was designed. One of the things they have is a very robust plank that goes down the middle called a king plank, and that's designed because of the chafing that you get from the huge logs that are placed across the deck. But they also have anything up to 5 sister keelsons on the inside of these things, excuse me, to support the vessel because of the intense weight and pressure that's on the deck. Now, this is, sorry, just a schematic that we've done with this. Now, these things were never steered by, they were never steered by a tiller arm. This was a later thing that was actually put on the Murray River boats, the Murray River sawmill boats. They were actually steered with chains. And so what would happen was that there was no helm or anything on these vessels. They would be towed out into the middle of the river where the deepest channel was, and very massively constructed chains were thrown over the side. So you're talking probably about 40 or 50 centimetre links, and they were thrown over on both sides. The chains would sit in the deepest part of the channel of the river, and the current would carry the vessel down, and it was steered by bargemen with poles, and to fend off on the bank. But it was mainly the chains dragging through the water that actually steered the vessels themselves. And this is where this characterization project starts to get interesting, is that we started to do some work in the initial season in 2015, and we found this vessel, which in the Murray River, if it's underwater, you're not going to see it. It's complete black water. You go down 2 feet and you can't see the hand in front of your face. This is a side scan image of an unidentified vessel that we found at Mildura. And here's a comparative model of an outrigger log barge from an aerial image, and you can see they're exactly the same. So now when we're finding vessels from side scan and imagery, etc., because we've archaeologically characterised them, we've got a much better idea of what we're looking at, those vessels in the river, so we can start assigning potential identities and also potential industries that they were used in. The other thing we found was this thing here, which was an image from the 1930s, which actually shows an outrigger log barge against the side of a bank. And originally we thought that this was a wreck that had been left on the side of the river, but what you can see here is that there's also, this is what they call a log slide, and there's a winch shed at the top here where the logs were actually dumped over the side and towed up, and then they were taken upstream, up the hill to the sawmill itself for processing. So it's giving us a much better understanding of what's going on. Sorry, I better move on quickly. So what we've come across in the river here is that we've realised that there's not like just paddle steamers and barges. There's actually multiple types of barges, and there's multiple types of paddle steamers. One of the things that we've been looking at is, okay, well, what type of vessels are we looking at? So we've got at least 7 or 8 different types of floating paddle steamers, everything from a Bethel boat, which is a floating church, to your floating Sainsbury's store, to insider barges, fishing boats, log barges, these things called bin barges, which were basically big bins that used to carry everything that were used for construction, and smaller things like dugout canoes that were used by Aboriginal people, cross-river punts that you can see here that predated bridges, desnagging boats that used to pull trees and things out of the water, and all of the auxiliary boats that used to service them as well too. So we tested this methodology in a drowned landscape that was a place called Lake Yarrawonga in 2018, and it definitely worked. So sorry, I'm running out of time. I haven't got time to go into this any further if anyone wants to ask more about it. But one of the things we're also looking at with this area is that this area had a weir put in it as part of the Murray River weir and lock system, which drowned a lot of different sites, but also drowned the landscapes. And so we're looking at whether you can actually look at the old river system and where it was and start doing sedimentology and to look at the climate conditions and environmental conditions that existed in those regions going back thousands of years. And this is what I'm talking about. You can actually see multiple river systems that were going on where you've got the dead end oxbows and through the rivers that date from back millennia. So overall with the project, what we're looking at differences in, and now that we've been looking at so many different areas, we can actually start looking at differences in ships construction and different types of technology and the social conditions that go on with those industries in different areas. So you're getting very different techniques that are being used in different regions. Between the northern region areas, the main key drivers up there is timber with the cedar industry, which does float, the timber which does float, but it's mainly sugarcane, but you've got dairy industry, whereas in the inland regions, you've actually got it's dairy, wool and wheat. And the types of infrastructure that you're getting made down in the Murray River is really robust wharves and piers and jetties, often 30 or 40 feet high, compared to in the northern regions, no wharves at all. The timber industry in the northern regions, you've actually got these things called drogers, which initially started this project off. another completely archaeologically undocumented type of site that we're looking into, and there's multiple different variations of those. And you can see that they would float the timber down the rivers there, and they would be pulled ashore in quite, gradual slopes to get them on up to the mills and the rivers. Whereas in the Murray River, you can see that they had to have these things called log slides, which you may interpret as just being, fallen trees, but they were there to roll the logs out of the river system without getting them covered in mud. And we've already covered the part of the timber system and how they would transport it already. So ideally, what we're trying to do is characterise what types of not only the archaeological signatures of what's going on, but the activities and the typologies of actually what's going on in the different river systems. And we're trying to do that across Australia now, because when you look at the Murray River system, it doesn't stop at the state border. It doesn't stop at, there's, because of one person's living in Victoria and one person's living on the other side, it doesn't mean that they're doing different activities. It's all part of a much wider system. So we're looking at trying to do it as a cultural landscapes approach. And we're also, as I said, we're trying to turn it into a national rivers and waterways project that's looking at cultural landscapes and looking at the different modes of travel. I'll probably leave it here. This is just a thanks to some of the people who've helped out in this section of the two bits of fieldwork that I've talked about here. Now, we do fieldwork for this. I try and do one day a fortnight, every second week of the year. So we're constantly finding new sites. We're constantly looking for people to help us. And because every single state has a river, then the potential for turning it into a national project is vast, but also looking at the differences between what's going on in one state and what's going on in another, particularly between industries or river types or conditions, is quite exciting. So look, I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've gone on long enough, and I think I've gone on over time too, haven't I, Peter? So thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks. Thanks so much for your presentation, Brad. That was absolutely fascinating. And as a Australian who's now over in the UK, it was a nice little trip down memory lane and learning a bit more about my own heritage. So thank you very much for that. And as we have an international audience, I hope that many people found that interesting and maybe found some things that they could relate to for their own research. I haven't received any questions yet. So if you do have any questions, please make sure to put them in the questions section. I have a few questions now to ask Brad from myself. If you would prefer, you can just unmute yourself and ask questions when I kind of open it up for a free-for-all question. But if I can go first, because that's my prerogative as leading everything. So Brad, I'm fascinated by the ghost images that you said that you have of the mangroves. So how does that work? Do you think that if you excavated, you would actually find things, or is it just, how do the ghost images work?
What happens is, as the mangroves grow up through the mud, what happens first off is the wrecks get dumped. The silt comes and gets trapped by the wrecks being in those areas, and then the mangroves are attracted to the silt and they start growing up through the silt itself. Now, if there's something in the way of where, so the mangroves can't get down far enough into the mud to grow, you end up with a ghost image. Now, we had it confirmed that there were sites actually underneath there, because some of them actually had bow and stern sections still poking up. Like, so we had done, I'm loath to call them stem and stern posts because they're double enders, but so yeah, we actually had proof that there was still things underneath, and we've used that technique a lot in the different mangroves areas, up and down the state, because the dumping of wrecks, we're finding is actually causing mangroves to actually occur in areas where previously they never had. And so it's a really interesting sedimentology and a geomorphological sort of observation of what's going on in those areas. So
fascinating. Thanks for that. I'm also interested, I think we might be able to come up with a brand new project right here tonight. What do you think about the big rudder project? We've already got the big anchor project and the big cannon project. Do you think that we could start collecting rudders and maybe use those as diagnostic features for identifying vessels, or is it a bit specific to river vessels?
Do you reckon you get enough interested audience? I mean, our rudders are. Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, so the Nautical Archaeology Society does repeated field work at Sandwich Flats in Kent, and we have found the most gorgeous rudder there, and everyone flocked to see it. And when we've gone back repeatedly, it's like, oh, is the rudder still there? Is the rudder still there? So you never know. People have all sorts of different fancies.
Well, one of the aspects that I've been looking at with these rudders, which is actually really interesting, is sorry, I'm just trying to get back to the slide for it. Is that the rudders that we've got have got this characteristic scallop out of the top of them, and it seems to be endemic to the Murray River. I've never seen it made like that anywhere else. I'm just getting there we go. So they've got the scallop at the top of them, and the tiller for the rudders is actually not mounted on the back of where you'd expect a tiller arm to be. It's mounted on chains to the back of the rudder itself, from what they call the tiller arm there. And so one of the aspects of what I'm interested in this is, well, where's this design come from? You know, like, is it a local innovation? Is it something that's actually been, brought in? You know, is it a cultural baggage that you've had a shipwright that's come in and they've used it elsewhere? And so I've been in touch with a friend who's a shipwright over in Denmark, Johans. I can't remember his last name at the moment, but he thinks that it might actually be a Dutch design, because he said to me when I was explaining it to him, he said, "Oh, maybe what we're looking at is I was describing it to him, not sending a photo. And he said a big like a barn door, and I said, yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, the rudder you're looking at here is 11 feet high, so it's about nearly 4 meters high.
Wow.
And so one of the other aspects that I'm looking at with this in regards to ships construction is that where are the design of the barges coming from? You know, and I was going to come over to England last year and this year as well too, but COVID, you know, happily enough, didn't let me do it. But I'm interested to see whether what we're looking at is a transferal of a design from the barge system and from the canal system, you know, at the entrances, you know, to or the rivers, or even the, you know, like the London sailing ketches, barges, whether we're looking at a transferal of those and a modification of them for Murray River transport. And what's interesting with these vessels as well too is that the more you get the vessel further away from the entrance of the Murray River, where, you know, the ocean entrance down in South Australia, the less maritime the barge becomes. And so what I'm thinking is actually happening with these vessels is that as people are moving further and further and further up the river and further away from where people, you know, where the shipwrights are traditionally encamped, then these barges, I think, are actually being made by people who've seen a barge, know what they look like, but who are local chippy, or, you know, the local, you know, tradesman who builds, you know, barns and things like that. And they're like, oh, well, I'll make a boat. This is how I'd make a structure on land, but so this is how I'll make a barge. And so these are flat-bottom vessels. The construction techniques that you see, particularly up towards Echuca, are very, very different to the, you know, to the beautiful wine glass sterns and things on the vessels that are operating down at the lower end of the rivers. They're very, you know, they're blunt. They've got diagonal bracing in them. They're very, they're not beautiful vessels. They're just functional. And so, you know, what I'd be interested in is if anyone's got any insights into where these designs may have come from. And when I come over, I'd love to talk to people of, you know, if they reckon they've got insights on, you know, where these types of vessels designs may have originated from.
Well, I wonder if anyone who's listening today might be able to provide some insight. So if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to give to Brad, you're welcome to unmute yourself now and ask. I think there's a small enough number of us to not cause too much chaos. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Brad or comment?
Suitably stunned. It's funny, I never get questions with this talk. It's either people are asleep or...
Because you've covered everything so thoroughly.
Well, that's a nice way of looking at it. So, yeah, so, you know, the other thing with this is that, you know, when we're looking at those droga wrecks up in the Northern Rivers regions, they were complete with the courses that were, and we've got no idea where the designs of those come from. Completely flat-bottomed, pontoon shaped. So, you know, like a rectangular pontoon with a slightly sloping bow on the front. And they were powered by an engine, a small steam engine that sat on deck with a donkey boiler, at the aft end of the vessel with the quarter-mounted paddle wheels, so they were like on the stern but on the side, and just a derrick crane. And what they would do is they would pull into the sides of the river, and again, no wharves or piers or whatever else for there, which is interesting because it sort of shows a lack of nodal points in the landscape. And they would just pull the log straight onto the deck. So, but other aspects of stuff that we're looking at is how people lived in these areas, what the social relationships were, because the rivers were the comings and going points as well too, where people would people would go off to war or they'd go off to hospital, and so there were points of great joy and great sorrow within the landscapes as well too. They connected the different mobs of Aboriginal people up and down the rivers. They brought in great wealth into the community. It was a great time of excitement because there was, when these vessels would come in, it'd be like, there was no local shops in the areas in a lot of these places, so they would have store boats which would, basically show up with everything, all and sundry. And so what would be interesting is if we could find a couple of those vessels, then similar to the Arabia that was over in Missouri, I think, river over in America. If we could find one of those that sunk, we would have a snapshot of what colonial life was like on the river itself. So it would make a really interesting archaeological excavation. So it's hard to touch on, like there's much more interesting social aspects of this, but I was sort of going for, trying to get people interested in the different types of vessels that we're looking at in this region.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us. And people who might be interested, if they've missed anything, or if they think they know someone who might like to listen to this talk, it will be available on YouTube in a week or two, as all of our talks have been. So this is the 9th in this series, but of course this is our 3rd webinar series that the Nautical Archaeology Society has run. We started webinars before everyone else did. Before COVID hit, we were already doing webinars. So thank you very much, Brad, for being part of this one. Thank you extremely for getting up so ridiculously early. I hope that you're able to maybe get a few hours of sleep before you have to start your proper work day.
Oh, the sun's just coming up today.
oh, maybe not. If anyone does think of any questions, you're welcome to send them in to us at nas@nauticalarchaeologysociety.org, and we will pass them on to Brad and he will answer them at a more civilized time. But for now, I would just like to say thank you very much to Brad, and I will just take over control briefly to advertise the next webinar. So you can see here, this is our list of current presentations that we've already had. They're already available on YouTube. So you can catch up there or listen again if you missed out on anything. It's quite diverse, very fascinating, the range that we've had. But the next talk that we're going to have next month is going to be by Philip Beale. And, oh, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. It's going to be Experimental Archaeology, a 15-year journey to show how the Phoenicians could have reached the Americas. That sounds quite fascinating. So please join us all next month. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to the Honor Frost Foundation for sponsoring these talks. Thank you very much for your time this evening.